Okay, the last principle we're going to need if we're going to find the sine, cosine, tangent, secant, cosecant, or cotangent of any angle in the plane, the last one is that we have to know the sign of the sine, cosine, or tangent of any in the plane where it ends. So we can outline a couple of little quick things right here. We saw in an earlier example, for instance, that we got positive and negative values for sine and cosine depending on where we were. Specifically, you'll remember this example. We said that if we had this angle in standard position that terminated in the second quadrant, we saw that sine was a positive value, cosine was a negative value, and tangent is a negative value. Well, that's important for us because that pattern gets repeated elsewhere in the plane depending on where the angle terminates. So consider sine. Sine is positive for angles that terminate either in the first quadrant or in the second quadrant. So our positive values right here, if you have an angle that terminates somewhere in the first quadrant, well, no problem, right? Because if theta is in the first quadrant, all three, sine, cosine, and tangent, are all positive. But in the second quadrant, only sine, and therefore, by the way, cosecant, would be positive. Right? So only sine of an angle that terminates in the second quadrant is positive. Right? All the rest of them are negative. We saw in our that example that it was positive for sine, but it was negative for cosine and tangent. Well, if we have the third quadrant, what happens there? Well, in the third quadrant, both the opposite side and the adjacent side are negative values. And when we take those negative values and divide them opposite over adjacent, we get a positive value. So in the third quadrant, tangent of the angle theta is positive. And by the way, so will be cotangent. All right, let's go to the fourth quadrant. In the fourth quadrant, we would note that the adjacent side over the hypotenuse is a positive value there. So in quadrant 4, we can see that if we had an angle terminating there, we're going to get a value of cosine of that angle that's positive, but all the other values will be negative, right? Because we've got a negative sign on our opposite side. Okay? So when that's the case, all the others are negative. Well, there's a really good memory tool called a mnemonic that goes like this. All students take calculus. That is, all its trigonometric functions in the first quadrant will be positive. In the second quadrant, only sine, and by the way, therefore cosecant, is positive. In the third quadrant, only tangent is positive, and therefore cotangent. And in the fourth quadrant, only cosine is positive. Oh, and therefore secant. All right, but all students take calculus. It's just a really quick way of remembering those signs. So we're going to keep these on board as we go into what we do next.